Good morning, everyone. This is a good place to be for a slow start to the day if you had a hard ending to yesterday's evening. We are starting our journey in 1937 in Chicago, United States of America, where Ted Nelson, the star of our show today, was born. He was the child of two Hollywood names. His mother, Celeste Holm, was a luminous actress who would soon after her son's birth, win her first Academy Award, and her father was a well-known Hollywood director who would direct the film that won Sidney Poitier his first Academy Award a few years later. So this is a fairy tale beginning of a golden boy from Hollywood. But as fairy tales go, it's not always as glamorous as it could seem. His parents' marriage collapsed just as soon as it started, I guess, and they both were pursuing their careers, not really caring for their son. So instead of the glitter and glamour of Los Angeles, he did not live with these people. He moved out east to his grandparents, who adopted him, so he became not only their grandson, but also their son, which is a very strange setup. But this arrangement gave him security, it gave him a home, it gave him a stability, and it gave him a family name that would protect him from the turbulence of Hollywood's glitz and glamour. And but he was sort of in a very special place. He was legally redefined, and he was set apart from his birth parents. And he was living in a world that wasn't quite his own. His grandparents were far from being Hollywood celebrities. They were intellectuals. And they lived in a home steeped with books, plays, conversation about philosophy, ideas. His mother/grandmother, Edith, had been a writer herself, and the entire family life revolved all around culture. They had novels and plays, shelves full of them, and it was an environment that was a different kind of stage from what his parents had. It was a literary stage where words carried the most important meaning in everyone's life, and it mattered above everything else. This was a home where reading was not only encouraged, it was expected. So, probably no one could have guessed it at this time when Ted, as a toddler, walked around looking at shelves upon shelves with these classic titles. But those words and those books would come to shape his big life project. But a kid who grows up does not necessarily care about the big classics at that age. So he found a special love for pulpy science fiction literature. One of his favorite authors was L. Ron Hubbard. This was way before his sort of endeavor into Scientology and starting that religion. And he was a renowned science fiction author. Two of Ted Nelson's favorite books was Old Document Methuselah, who was probably still is, since the book still exists. He was a physician who traveled around the universe healing people. And the other book by the same author was The Typewriter in the Sky. The Typewriter in the Sky is a very interesting story. It's about a pianist who has a friend who's an author. And every time the author writes something into his novel, he can hear the clanking sounds of the typewriter in the sky. And what is written changes this pianist's life, sending him out on swashbuckling adventures that aren't necessarily of his own choosing. Very much like Ted Nelson's life up until that point, since he had all of this drama that was inspired by Hollywood, started in Hollywood, but very different from a Hollywood film. But as a teenager, Nelson discovered The Voyage of the Space Beagle. It's another pulpy science fiction novel, and it was a book that would change the course of his life. It follows the crew on a starship with experts from every imaginable scientific discipline. And they encounter terrifying alien threats as they move around the universe. And these scientists are constantly at odds with each other, each one trapped in their narrow field of knowledge and science. And there is a hero in the book who saves them all, and he calls himself a nexialist. An nexialist, defined in the book not as a specialist, but someone trained to weave together knowledge from across different disciplines and domains. This idea electrified Ted Nelson. At the age of 9, reading this book, he knew what his life's mission was. He was going to become that nexialist, not someone who knew something about just one thing, but someone who moved across the board of everything. So he didn't want to be boxed in as a programmer or a writer or a filmmaker. He wanted to cross those boundaries. And this inspired him so much that he actually drew up his own business card he carried around and showed to people, where it read, Theodore H. Nelson, Nexialist. So in his grandparents' house, you would always find magazines, newspapers lying around, and it was just as natural for them to discuss whatever they had read in these magazines at the dinner table as talking about the day's events. I think we have a brushing sound from our beard, so we're going to move that a bit. And in the September 10, 1945 edition of this issue of Life magazine, there was an article that would definitely inspire young Ted Nelson. This was one word Bush's seminal article, As We May Think. Now, Vannevar Bush was a towering figure in wartime science in the United States of America. He was President Roosevelt's advisor and the man who had overseen America's research efforts during the war. In this essay, however, he does not look back at World War. He is looking forward to peace. And he writes about the accelerating flood of information that is accumulating in people's lives, and how that information gives us a need for new ways to think, new ways to connect knowledge, and new ways to manage knowledge. This is the first time the word or phrase knowledge management is used. And his vision in this essay is not only science as a means for invention, but as a partner for human thought and creativity. It was an unforgettable read for young Ted Nelson, and he was particularly inspired by this little machine that was illustrated in the magazine. It's this one. It's called the Memex. And in this article, Bush describes this thing that looks like an ordinary desk, except inside there is something hidden. It's something extraordinary. It's a personal archive of knowledge. Using microfilm, a person would store all of their books, records, notes, and articles. But the real invention is not the storage. It's the buttons and levers that you can pull and create associative trails between items, linking one passage in a scientific article to something in a related book and then to your own notes. And the extraordinary thing about the Memex is that the machine will remember those paths for you, those connections that you have created, so you can go back and follow them and discover information, and through that maybe discover something else, take the microfilm, hand it to some other person, and they can build upon the knowledge that you have accumulated. The Memex was just a concept. It was never built, at least not as this mechanical machine, but still, I believe this is an extraordinary machine. There were a lot of things that happened in young Nelson's life at this time. At one point, he walked past a florist, and there was a sign outside that read, "Flowers by wire." This was the slogan of the florist telegraph delivery network, and it was a network created in the early 20th century for people to send flowers across the country in the United States of America. And it worked in this way. You could walk into a shop in New York, buy or pay for a bouquet of flowers, and they would telegram a florist in, for example, Los Angeles, and they would put together the bouquet there and bring it to the person you had bought it for. It's still something that you can do. You can go online and order flowers for friends and family and loved ones. This is the concept you're using. But Ted Nelson, being a young boy, did not read this as marketing. He took that slogan literally. And it set off a chain of thoughts in his mind where he started thinking about, how on earth is this possible? How can you dismantle a flower and transfer it over a radio signal or a telephone wire? And he sat down and figured that this must be something like, we take off all the leaves, then all the petals, then we take the stem and we feed it into this machine that can, in some way or another, encode the structure and the concept of a flower. And then you would have a machine on the other end that would reconstruct this one. He has pages up and down with illustrations and notes in his childhood notepads with his thinking about this. And what was he doing? He was defining a protocol. This was an integration technology. Only to young Nelson, it was still a mystery how those things would work. Later, he got into Swarthmore College. And having the background he had, he did not go into computer science or any scientific fields. He studied philosophy, he studied film, he studied writing. Whatever would spark his restless imagination, he would sign up for a class in. He made short films, he experimented with theater. He did mostly any form of storytelling, even experimental publishing. He has some really interesting publications from this time that would be sort of beat poetry meets Japanese origami, where you would fold things in strange ways. These are magazines that look like nothing else. And this was a time where computers were still something remote, something that would be found in laboratories and really not available to the ordinary person. After a long struggle, he finally managed to get into Harvard. And Harvard was a different university from Swarthmore College. And here he had his first encounters with computers. And Ted, being Ted, he asked the questions of, how will these computers define my life? How will these things influence me? And he didn't think about these machines as something that crunched and computed, did calculations, worked with numbers. He saw them as something that could serve his imagination. So even if he was not trained as a computer scientist, he started thinking about how can we make these computers work for the better good of humanity.
The research program that I'm going to describe for you is quickly characterizable by saying, if in your office you as an intellectual worker were supplied with a computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsible, responsive, instantly responsive to every action you have, how much value could you derive from that? Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center at Stanford Research Institute.
So, in December 1968, an engineer named Douglas Engelbart took the stage and shared his vision for the future. During a 90-minute presentation, the audience watched in stunned silence as he demonstrated something that no one had seen before. On a giant screen behind him, Engelbart clicked a small wooden device he called a mouse. Text appeared in windows on screen, and he edited documents live, navigated links in those documents, even collaborated with colleagues that were at a remote location miles away. Now, this single event has later been known as the mother of all demos. This is the OG, Douglas Engelbart. And in this performance, you know, he defined the tools that would become modern computing. But none of these things were really new to Ted Nelson, because during his work at Harvard, he had already seen this research going into this at Engelbart's Augmented Human Intellect Research Center, but also at places like Stanford and, of course, Palo Alto Xerox PARC. And the systems the scientists there were working on were word processing, outlining system, collaborative editing, all of them interesting, but Nelson felt that all of these people missed the point, because they were really just recreations of the typewriters that we already had, trying to move the metaphor of paper onto the screen. And this is the editing, text processing demo that Engelbart did in this mother of all demos, where he changed the word all men in the Declaration of Independence to all people are created equal. It's an important bit of history, but Ted Nelson had different ideas about how text was to be edited. And given his literary background, he found it particularly interesting how the author William Burroughs worked while writing his novels, such as The Soft Machine. William Burroughs was one of the Beat generation's most important writers, and he had a very special technique for how he would write his books. So this is a passage as it might have been written for The Soft Machine. But what he would do is that he would take scissors and cut up his text into the words that make up the text, and then just jumble them around until he found a different meaning from the same words. And this gave Nelson the idea of how he saw that editing on a computer could be done. It was not really about erasing and overwriting things, it was about rearranging ideas and thought. And at Harvard, he managed to get the resources to create his very first computer program. It's the JOT editor, JOT being short for juggler of text. And this is a small screen, but just notice one thing down here. Structured object text, that's JOT. But then we have a hypertextual editor. Now, there's a word for you, hypertext. We'll get back to that. The JOT editor was the first step towards what would become Ted Nelson's grand vision for what computers should do. And working on this, he had one grand idea, that text would not only be transformed by computers, but also that computers would be transformed by text. So this was similar in the user experience sense to what had been done at the mother of all demos. You would edit things in the text. The real invention in this was what happened behind the scenes and how this was all stored. Because at this time, the most common medium of computer storage was tape. And instead of storing this as a file, Ted Nelson realized that he would store this as a stream, endless, continuous stream of the things that made up the text. So here we have the fox jumped over the, yeah, you know, the old example. Whenever you made a change to the text, you would not go back and overwrite anything on the tape. You would just store the change onto the tape. Now, that is very much how something like a blockchain or a Git repository works today. It's a continuous stream of changes. And this storage concept, in combination with the paper he presented at the ACM conference in Cleveland in 1965, with a fairly unusual title describing this storage mechanism. The title for the paper was A File Structure for the Complex, the Changing, and the Indeterminate. And in this paper, he uses for the very first time the word the hypertext. So Ted Nelson is the person who invented the concept of hypertext and also coined the word hypertext. One of many words that Ted Nelson has to his name. This was, of course, very much inspired by Vannevar Bush's The Memex. That's where all of these ideas originate. And 20 years on from when he first opened up that Life magazine, it has become something of a reality. There was, though, something that was bothering Ted Nelson a lot about what computer science was like, and that is what he calls the priesthood. The priesthood of computer science, which in his definitions were the insiders. It was people like us, the programmers and operators of computers, who alone understood the arcane rituals of compilers, the punch cards, the command line syntaxes, and to everyone else outside of this cult, computers were intimidating, they were mysterious, and they were even forbidden to use. And the priesthood's power lay in making these machines seem too complex for outsiders to even approach. And to Nelson, this was infuriating because he truly believed that computers were not to be part of the domain of a technical elite. It was a tool for creativity, and it should be available to everyone. And he saw this as the worst form of gatekeeping, where the scientists lined up in front of their altar of a mainframe computer and kept people at the distance. And for using an unintelligible language, they kept people outside of their domain, not allowing people in even if they asked the question, how can we understand what computers are if we aren't allowed to use one? And this is the time where Nelson puts his foot down and writes his manifesto. This one, Computer Lib, with the call to arms. You can and must understand computers now. This is a book like no other. It was self-published by Nelson in 1974, and it's part manifesto, part handbook for how to use computers. And it has cartoons, slogan, plain language explanations of how computers work, written for laymen to understand this. It's all created by Nelson himself, written on a typewriter, drawn by hand, cut and pasted and glued together, and then photocopied and self-published. So it would have all of these explanations about how computers actually work, what the internals of a computer look like, but it also had something that Nelson called the deep, dark secret, which was really an explanation done in very simple to understand layman terms about how a computer worked and how you can think about a computer and grasp the basic concepts of computer science. He mixed this with satire. He is a peculiar figure in that sense. He had loads of personal opinion, and he's a very opinionated guy. It had utopian speculation about what computers can be, and it felt more like a revolutionary pamphlet than a computer textbook, particularly if you flipped it over, because this book was 2 books in one. On the flip side of Computer Lib, you would find this book, Dream Machines, which is the talk you're attending right now. And this was a totally different book from what Computer Lib was. This was Nelson's vision of the future and what computers would become. In this book, he envisions things like interactive films, text as being edited by many people, and he outlines his life project called Xanadu. The title Xanadu comes from a poem by Coleridge from 1816. It's called The Kubla Khan, and it starts with a very famous fragment. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. The castle in the distance. And Coleridge describes a dreamlike world of caverns, winding rivers that brings a magnificent and mysterious world together, which was to be the metaphor for his Xanadu project. Now, Xanadu is his lifelong work, and we will be following Xanadu for the remainder of this presentation. But in Dream Machines, when he first starts talking about this, computers are not available to the general public. As he says with Computer Lib, they are something that belong to a small elite of computer scientists. So Nelson imagines computers being made available to people in franchises, computer cafes, if you may, built on a model similar to what McDonald's is, where you can go with your friends. It's a very social place, and sit down at computer terminals and have access to the entire world's vast network of knowledge. Both in text form, he also imagines films and videos being part of this, sound, just about every form of information available. But there's one important thing here. It's not only about consuming information, it's also about contributing your own into this vast, ever-growing network of information. So we can imagine that a Xanadu terminal would look something like this. And there is something very important to note about this, because this vision of a connected world is not about the mechanics that bring it together. It's not a technical system, but it's a philosophy. As he learned from Vannevar Bush's Memex, he truly believes that all of the world's information is interwoven, and that computers should reflect that notion of information. So it's not about the computers themselves, it's about making these computers a tool for liberating human imagination and giving everyone the opportunity to explore ideas freely, see the lineage of ideas, and build upon them without barriers. And during the 70s and early 80s, he has the funding to do his research on his Xanadu project and start building. In 1981, he publishes this volume called Literary Machines, which really takes this from the concept that he had published in 1974 and turns it into something that is more of a specification for what this is to become. Again, this was a self-published work. It was typed up on a typewriter, and the book structure follows the way that Nelson thinks about information itself. So it's fairly unstructured. It's not a book that you would read from cover to cover. You will jump around between different sections of the book, much like hyperlinks tying the book together. He would also publish this himself. The front cover of the first 1981 edition is a thing of beauty. It was made on something called a Saxon machine. And I do see some people in the audience who might be old enough to have experienced that. This made his home smell of vinegar for weeks on end. Have you ever had any copies made that are blue in color and a bit wet and the smell of vinegar? Anyone? Yeah, there are some hands going up. That's the Saxon machine, and that's what he used for the cover of this one. So it's sort of a lithography cover on this book. It was striking. It was silk screened onto this. But it was not just philosophy. It laid out the concepts of the implementation of Xanadu and his hyperlink system. As we know, links on the web today, they are one-directional. And one of the central concepts in Nelson's vision was that every link was bidirectional. So when you linked to something, you could see from the other end what linked to it as well. So this is, of course, what Google would go on to do with their PageRank algorithm and build their search engine empire upon. Had Nelson's visions prevailed, that would have been an intrinsic part of the web as we know it today. And these links were permanent. So even if a document changed or was moved or anything else, the links would still remain intact. Even if the document was taken offline, because remember, this is an endless tape of information where nothing is deleted, it's just added. So the links would go back to the current version that the link is valid for. There are some very interesting ideas in this, but I think this really becomes interesting when we come to the concept that Ted Nelson describes as transclusion, which is the mechanism for quoting information from one data source to the other. So imagine an element on the page. Today you would probably mark that text and you would copy and you would paste it into something else. When you do that in the Xanadu system, you create a link back to the original content so that authorship is retained, and it would, as with the other links, be a living reference back to the original content and back to the original source. So this meant that whenever you reuse text, photos, images, or any media, a trail would go back and the source would always be visible. It's a very, very interesting idea. We also touched upon the idea of versioning. Since nothing would be deleted, you would have a permanent record of every single change that has ever been made to a document. And you also had the concept of people being able to contribute their own information to existing elements of documentation. So imagine that as writing your own notes onto the margin of a book. Those notes would then become visible to everyone else reading the same piece of information. Now, there are some challenges with this, I can truly see that, but it's a very interesting take on collaboration and also things like social media. So during the 1980s, there were many iterations of the literary machines specification published. Nelson was working with investors from big companies like Autodesk to build this system, and he had a team working with him. So he kept on building throughout the 1980s. There were some things happening during that time. For instance, in 1984, it was a milestone in computing history when the Apple Macintosh arrived on the market. And this was the computer that fulfilled the vision from Xerox PARC, and what goes back to the mother of all demos, because this computer had the mouse, it had the windows, it had the capabilities to click on things, edit text, and so forth. And this was the thing that realized the manifesto that Ted Nelson had published in 1974. The Apple Macintosh brought computing to the masses. It turned computers into something that ordinary people could use. But Ted Nelson was still unimpressed because in his mind, the Apple Macintosh, even how revolutionary it was a narrowing of his vision. It was not an extension, because instead of reinventing literature, which was Nelson's mission with computers, this was something that recreated something familiar. It was he said, a desktop metaphor that makes your computer look as messy as your desk does. And I can truly confirm that that is something that is true. I'm not going to show you my desktop, but it can be messy at some times. Because to Nelson, this was missing the point. He has a rant where he goes on about text processing software being about having fun with fonts instead of finding new ways to create literature. Because it's all built around familiar metaphors of paper. If you think about it, something like Microsoft Word is really a set of pages displayed on screen. And similarly with a spreadsheet, it's just the good old ledger spread out in 2 dimensions. So it was all digital recreations of paper to Ted Nelson. And he was way more ambitious. He wanted to move beyond that and transcend the world of paper and make digital information into a universe of its own. And one thing that is really interesting with Ted Nelson is that he never runs out of ideas. And this is probably also one of his challenges, is that he never completes anything. So while working at Xanadu, he starts thinking about a new project that is going to become part of his vision and the platform. That makes things even more complicated, but also even more interesting. Because when we come to the 1990s, he has spent almost a full decade creating Xanadu. There are prototypes around. He has the idea of Xanadu becoming a commercial project. So he sticks with his 1974 idea of having the franchises where people can come into his Xanadu computer cafes and contribute to this network that he owns. But building these things with the two-dimensional links proves to be a bit of a challenge. And the solution for Ted Nelson to that is to come up with another word and another concept. So in 1990, he introduces the bold idea of what he calls Zigzag. And since he has a Hollywood background and he has studied film, he has been an amateur filmmaker throughout his life, he goes to the place he knows best, and that is film editing. And he thinks about the way that information should be stored, not as a cassette tape these days, but as film. And film was still analog in the early 90s, but film is a set of frames that make up a story. And each of these frames can be part of very different takes on the same story, or different dimensions, if you will. So when he is envisioning his Xanadu docuverse, he thinks about how will you be able to navigate through these links, through the transclusions, and through everything that makes up this realm of information, this multidimensional space. And he sees this as a set of film strips where you can take different directions where you come to one piece of information, and that this diverges out into a multidimensional space. So in his Zigzag universe, information is broken into small units, but instead of being locked into one specific relation or place, it's all built up of multidimensional connections between all of the pieces of information. Knowing how to write computer programs, that does not make things simpler. It makes things a whole lot more challenging to implement. But he has his team, he still continues building this, and then something happens. Because in 1994, Netscape Navigator is released, and suddenly the web is not just a research project anymore. It's something that is overnight in the hands of millions. And with a click, you can browse from page to page, and the concept of the internet just exploded into public consciousness. Tim Berners-Lee was obviously inspired by Ted Nelson's work. That is why this is called hypertext in the web as we know it today. That word comes from Nelson, as we know. But instead of going the full Monty with Zigzag and all of the concepts, Tim Berners-Lee World Wide Web offered a simple system of documents that are linked together with these one-way hyperlinks. This was a bitter moment for Ted Nelson. He has been working on building an information system that looks like what the web is for, well, more than 30 years already, and it's not his idea that becomes the popular mainstream. That does not stop him, because this idea of the World Wide Web is not as good as what he has the concept for, and he still believes in his own idea that his ideas are better and should be the ones that are used. There is one important invention in the Netscape Navigator web browser that is credited to Ted Nelson for being his invention, and that's the back button. So whenever you click a back button in any sort of software or on your phone or your TV remote control, you are using a concept that Ted Nelson invented when he started working and playing around with hypertext for the first time. So at least there is one bit of legacy. in there. But let's do a thought experiment. After all, Ted Nelson was a philosopher. Let's look at a alternative timeline. So let's go all the way back to 1960s. 1962, Ted Nelson coins the word hypertext for the first time. It's published in 1965 for the first time. At the same time, he outlines the first visions for his Xanadu as a product specification. He wants, and has still wanted, Xanadu to become a product. Let's change that. Instead of making Xanadu a product, let's turn it into a specification that followed the concepts of how other computer science work was done at the time. And let's imagine something like a hypertext linking protocol, and that defines the concepts of the ideas that underpin Xanadu. And that might change things when we come to the 1970s, and we could have a request for comments on things like bidirectional links, transclusion notations, and document versioning, going into the very fundamentals of what is to become the internet later on. This is the same time as things like the ARPANET is built, and networks are created, and the foundations for the web as we know it today are laid. So at the time when he publishes Literary Machines, we could imagine that we have a hypertext standards working group, similar to what we have with all other technologies today. And that could also influence Tim Berners-Lee in even more ways than just picking up on the hypertext concept, because we could use all of the things that Nelson has come up with and make that part of the web. So instead of having things like one-way links and simple HTML, we could have more advanced markup and bidirectional links. And when the first popular browser, the Mosaic browser, is released, it would not be a web browser, it could be a HyperNet browser. And as the web and internet continues to develop, we would maybe avoid some of the big issues that were there along the way. Around the turn of the millennium, piracy was a big thing. Nelson had already come up with a concept that could have changed that, because one of the concepts that he describes in Literary Machines is the trademark concept of transcopyright. And transcopyright is the concept of transclusion, the mechanism for quoting one piece of information and using it in another context, but having a micropayment mechanism in place to pay the owner of the intellectual property whenever it was being used. So that would mean that music could just be published freely online, and the artists would be paid whenever they use something like that. It would also maybe change things like social media of the 2010s, because you have the mechanism of annotating everything. So instead of having to go to Twitter or Facebook to make your comment on something you have seen online or something that happens in the world, you could make that comment directly onto the newspaper article or whatever you want to make it, and it will be visible to everyone else, and the social media would actually be part of the web itself. Because remember that Ted Nelson's vision for this was this to be something that fostered human creativity and brought people together in their creative efforts and building this universe of information. If we look forward, look into the crystal ball, his ideas could have a tremendous impact on the world we live in today. One of the big challenges that the world is facing today is the idea of disinformation. And one of the books that has influenced Ted Nelson a lot is George Orwell's 1984. Sadly, we do see that some governments around the world are trying to rewrite history, which is one of the big concepts in that book. And the way that Nelson's Xanadu would work is that nothing would never be deleted. Changes would just be made, and the changes that had been made would be visible. So doing things like fact-checking and seeing the relations in between things would be a natural part of the information system and the way we consume information itself, which would make running disinformation operations a whole lot more difficult to do than what it is today. Also imagine things like unleashing human creativity. So think about a teenage kid in their bedroom working on their computer, creating music and wanting to use samples from two great classic jazz albums. Instead of acquiring the license to actually publish that, through the micropayments and the trans-copyright mechanisms of how every bit of information would be published, the original artists and the rights holders would be compensated, so it would be much easier for an artist to actually get their music released, and everyone would be paid. Everyone is happy. And if we also look at something like the alien life forms of artificial intelligence that have gobbled up more or less every piece of information created by a human ever, that information would be traceable through transclusions, and we would not have the problem of identifying what the original bit of information was, who owns the right to that information, and the big problem about maybe artificial intelligence and generative AI these days being the biggest example of theft we have ever seen. It could be done in an ethical, acceptable manner. And this brings us to when we have to look into the future and the harvest of our yesterdays. This book will become relevant soon, so keep an eye out. Because Ted Nelson is 88 years old now. He still believes in the Xanadu project, and he still keeps on building the idea and the dream that has guided his life since the age of 9.
It's been very long, but I've been absolutely sure of what I've been doing all the time. So one of the main definitions of paranoia is believing what nobody else believes. So one cure is for the patient to change his mind and believe what the rest of the world believes. That is the low road. The other, by which I hope to cure myself, is to persuade everybody else. And then I will no longer be paranoid, but recognized as having been right all along.
Thank you, Ted. And thank you for coming to this talk early in the morning. It's been a pleasure presenting this for you. I hope you have a great rest of the final day of NDC TechTown. Thank you so much for spending our first hour of the day with me. Thank you. So we do have time for questions. Otherwise, you can just mark them up on my presentation, and they will be visible for everyone. If you want to talk about this, just come find me. I will be around for some time. But thank you so much for coming.